Welcome to channel where we bring you heartwarming stories of courage, resilience, and the extraordinary power of the human spirit. Today, we're diving into an incredible story, one that will leave you inspired and remind you that even in the darkest moments, hope and determination can light the way. It's the story of James Miller, a young boy who faced seemingly insurmountable odds to uncover the truth, free his innocent father, and change the course of his family's life forever. Trust me, this is a journey you won't want to miss. After you've heard James's story, let us know in the comments what you think. What would you have done in James's shoes? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where standing up for what's right made all the difference? Share your thoughts, because your stories inspire us just as much as the ones we tell. The early morning sun spilled over the cracked pavement of Willow Lane, casting long shadows on the bustling streets of Eastbridge. Vendors shouted about their wares, the scent of fresh bread mingling with the acrid smell of exhaust from the old buses rumbling by. Among the sea of hurried faces, a young boy weaved through the crowd, his steps purposeful yet unhurried. James Miller was 13, but life had aged him beyond his years. Clutching a weathered backpack, he made his way toward school, his father's old watch tucked safely in his jacket pocket. The watch no longer worked, its hands frozen at 11:23, but it was more than a timepiece to James. It was a connection to his father, Robert Miller, who had been absent for over a year, wrongfully convicted of theft. Robert was serving a sentence in Stonemore Prison, a place James imagined as cold and unforgiving. The watch had been Robert's prized possession. This watch, he had often told James, is a reminder that time is precious. Use it wisely, and never let anyone steal your hope. James gripped the watch tightly whenever he thought of his father, feeling the weight of those words as both a comfort and a burden. Robert's imprisonment had left James's mother, Linda, to bear the weight of their small family alone. She worked long hours at a nearby laundromat, her hands chapped and her face drawn from exhaustion. Despite the struggles, Linda refused to let despair take root. "James," she would say, "we have to keep moving forward. Your dad would want that." But James knew the world wasn't as simple as his mother made it sound. Each day, he saw people in their neighborhood swallowed by despair, dreams crushed by the weight of poverty and injustice. Still, he clung to the belief that his father's innocence would one day be proven. That belief burned brighter each time he touched the watch, as if its frozen hands whispered promises of a better future. That morning, James crossed Main Street, his mind occupied with thoughts of the chores waiting for him after school. As he approached the intersection, a familiar figure caught his eye. Officer Emily Carter stood at the corner, her bright orange vest reflecting the sunlight. She directed traffic with sharp, practiced movements, her expression calm but weary. Emily was a rare presence in Eastbridge, a police officer who treated the community with respect. Unlike others on the force, she smiled at the children, sometimes offering them kind words or small treats. James didn't know much about her, but her kindness stood out in a world that often felt indifferent. As James waited to cross the street, he noticed something unusual. Emily's hand occasionally rested on her slightly swollen belly. She was pregnant, and despite the demanding nature of her job, she continued working, her dedication apparent. "She shouldn't be here," James thought, frowning. "It's too dangerous." The blare of a truck's horn snapped him out of his thoughts. Emily turned to guide the massive vehicle as it reversed into a narrow alley. Suddenly, a panicked shout erupted from further down the street. "Look out!" James's head whipped around. A man on a bicycle careened toward the intersection, his handlebars wobbling as he struggled to regain control. The bike veered wildly, heading straight for Emily, who stood with her back turned to the oncoming danger. Time seemed to slow as James processed what was happening. People around him froze, some lifting their phones to record the unfolding chaos. No one moved to help. "Ma'am, watch out!" James shouted, his voice cutting through the noise as he sprinted toward her. Emily turned just in time to see James barreling toward her. Before she could react, he pushed her out of the bike's path. The momentum sent them both stumbling, but James managed to steady her, his hand gripping her elbow firmly. The cyclist skidded to a halt a few feet away, his bike crashing to the ground with a metallic clang. A small crowd gathered, murmuring in concern and confusion. Emily, one hand protectively on her belly, looked at James with wide, astonished eyes. Are you okay? James asked, his breath coming in short gasps. Did it hit you? Emily shook her head, her face pale but composed. No, I'm fine, thanks to you. Her voice trembled slightly, gratitude evident in her tone. You saved me and my baby. James felt a flush of relief but also embarrassment as curious eyes turned toward him. Before he could respond, a commanding voice boomed from behind. Emily, are you all right? James turned to see a tall man in a police uniform striding toward them. His face etched with concern. It was Michael Carter, Emily's husband and the chief of police. He reached his wife's side in moments, his protective demeanor softening when he saw she was unharmed. I'm fine, Michael, Emily assured him. This boy, he saved me. Michael's sharp gaze shifted to James, initially scrutinizing, then softening. You did that? He asked, his voice low and steady. James nodded, his anxiety making him fidget with the strap of his backpack. I just saw she needed help. Michael crouched slightly, bringing himself to James's level. You didn't just help her. You saved my family. Thank you. James felt the weight of Michael's words but didn't know how to respond. All he could think about was his father, locked away for a crime he hadn't committed. As Michael straightened, he asked, What's your name, son? James Miller, he replied, his voice firm despite his nervousness. Michael's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing his features. Miller, I've heard that name before. James hesitated, then took a deep breath. This was his chance. Sir, he began, his voice trembling but resolute. Can you help me? My dad, Robert Miller, he's in prison for something he didn't do. I just want someone to look into his case. Please. Michael studied the boy for a long moment, his own instincts as an officer clashing with the desperation he saw in James's eyes. Finally, he nodded. I'll look into it, he promised, his voice steady, but I can't make any guarantees. James felt a surge of hope, clutching the watch in his pocket as if it could anchor him to this moment. For the first time in over a year, he felt like the wheels of justice might finally start turning. James walked home that evening with a sense of cautious optimism. His mind replayed the encounter with Chief Michael Carter, clinging to the man's words. I'll look into it. It wasn't a promise of resolution, but it was more than anyone else had offered since his father's arrest. When James arrived at their small apartment, he found his mother, Linda, standing at the kitchen counter. Her tired hands kneaded dough for the bread she baked every week to sell to neighbors. The faint aroma of yeast filled the room, mixing with the sound of the radio playing softly in the background. You're late, she said without looking up. Dinner's almost ready. James hesitated, unsure how to broach the subject. Mom, he began tentatively, dropping his bag onto the floor. I talked to someone today. Someone who might be able to help Dad. Linda stopped kneading and turned to face him, her expression cautious but curious. What do you mean? Who? Chief Carter, James said, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. I saved his wife, Officer Emily Carter, from an accident today. I told him about Dad, and he said he'd look into his case. Linda's hands stilled, and for a moment, she simply stared at James. Then she sighed and wiped her hands on a dishcloth. James, I don't want you getting your hopes up. We've been through this before. People make promises, but nothing ever changes. But this is different, James insisted, his voice rising. He's the police chief. Mom, if anyone can do something, it's him. Linda's expression softened, though her eyes remained heavy with doubt. She reached out and placed a hand on James's shoulder. I know you want to believe. Sweetheart, I do too, but I've learned not to count on miracles. James nodded, though her words stung. He understood her hesitation. Life had taught them both to guard their hearts against disappointment. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this time, something might finally change. The next morning, Chief Carter sat in his office, staring at a folder labeled, Miller. Robert, case number 8427. It was a file he hadn't touched since taking over as chief a year ago. The case had seemed straightforward at the time. Robert Miller, a security guard at Lockridge Warehouse, had been caught on surveillance footage leaving the premises on the night of a major theft. Another employee, Paul Stevenson, had testified against him, claiming to have seen Robert acting suspiciously. The evidence had been damning, leading to a swift conviction. But as Michael reviewed the case now, something nagged at him. He remembered James's plea. The conviction in the boy's voice. My dad didn't do it. Michael had seen enough cases to know that the truth wasn't always what it seemed. Especially in a system prone to mistakes and corruption. He began by watching the surveillance footage. At first glance, it appeared clear. A man resembling Robert Miller was seen exiting the warehouse late at night. But as the video played, Michael noticed something odd. The footage became grainy and distorted at key moments. Particularly when the figure was facing the camera. Was it a technical glitch? Or had the video been altered? Next, Michael reviewed Paul Stevenson's testimony. In the official report, Paul claimed to have seen Robert leaving the warehouse with a suspicious bag. But Michael found it strange that there were no details about what was in the bag or why Paul had been at the warehouse after hours. Michael leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Something about the case didn't sit right with him. He decided to start digging deeper. Beginning with Paul Stevenson. Later that afternoon, Michael drove to a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. He had tracked Paul Stevenson to Unit 3B, a small, dimly lit flat that smelled of mildew and stale cigarettes. Paul opened the door cautiously, his eyes narrowing when he saw the police chief standing on his doorstep. "Chief Carter," he said, his voice tinged with apprehension. "What brings you here?" "I need to ask you some questions about the Robert Miller case," Michael said, keeping his tone even. "Do you have a moment?" Paul hesitated, glancing nervously over his shoulder. I already gave my testimony. That was over a year ago. Why are you bringing it up now?" "Because there are inconsistencies in the case," Michael replied, "and I believe you might know more than you let on." Paul's eyes darted around the hallway, his body tense. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've got nothing to say." Michael stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Paul, if you were pressured into giving false testimony, now's the time to come clean. Otherwise, you'll go down with anyone involved in framing Robert Miller." Paul's face flushed, and for a moment, Michael thought he might slam the door. But instead, Paul sighed and stepped aside. "Fine, come in." Inside, the apartment was sparsely furnished, with peeling wallpaper and a small TV blaring an old sitcom. Paul gestured for Michael to sit but remained standing, his arms crossed defensively. "I didn't want to get involved," Paul began, his voice low, "but I didn't have a choice. They told me to say I saw Robert leaving with the bag. Even though I didn't, I wasn't even near the warehouse that night." Michael's heart sank. "Who told you to lie?" Paul hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes. "It was Lieutenant Hayes. He said if I didn't back up the story, he'd make sure I lost my job. I had a family to think about." Michael's jaw tightened. Marcus Hayes was a lieutenant in the department, known for cutting corners and bending rules. If Hayes had been involved, this case was more than a simple mistake, it was deliberate corruption. "Why would Hayes want to frame Robert?" Michael asked. Paul shrugged. "I don't know. All I know is that they wanted someone to take the fall. Robert was just unlucky." Michael stood, his mind racing. "Paul, I need you to testify. If we're going to clear Robert's name, we need your statement on record." Paul shook his head vehemently. "No way. Hayes has connections. If I speak out, I'll be the next one they come after." Michael placed a reassuring hand on Paul's shoulder. "I'll make sure you're protected. But this is your chance to do the right thing." Paul didn't respond, his fear evident. Michael left the apartment, determined to gather more evidence before confronting Hayes. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that Robert Miller's conviction was just the tip of the iceberg. Michael returned to his office that evening, his thoughts heavy with the implications of Paul Stevenson's confession. If Lieutenant Marcus Hayes had orchestrated Robert Miller's conviction, there was no telling how deep the corruption ran. Michael knew he couldn't approach this recklessly. Hayes was not only cunning but also well connected within the department. As Michael began drafting a plan, he decided to start by revisiting the surveillance footage. The grainy, distorted frames still bothered him. He contacted the department's tech specialist, Ryan Walker, a young officer known for his expertise in digital forensics. "Ryan," Michael said, handing him the file, "I need you to analyze this footage. Look for anything unusual, tampering, edits, anything that could indicate the video's been altered." Ryan nodded, his curiosity piqued. "I'll get on it right away, Chief." While Ryan worked on the video, Michael turned his attention to the access logs from Lockridge Warehouse. If Hayes had gone to such lengths to frame Robert, There was a good chance the access records had been tampered with as well. He requested the original data from the warehouse security team, hoping to uncover another piece of the puzzle. Meanwhile, James sat in his apartment, staring at the repaired watch in his hand. His mother, Linda, had already gone to bed, leaving the small living room quiet and dimly lit. Despite her doubts, James couldn't stop himself from hoping that Chief Carter would uncover the truth. The sound of a knock at the door startled him. James hurried to open it, surprised to find Michael standing there. "Chief Carter," James said, his voice a mix of surprise and excitement. "Did you find something?" Michael stepped inside, motioning for James to sit. "I'm making progress, but I need your help." James's heart raced. "What can I do?" Michael placed a folder on the table and opened it to reveal a list of names, employees at the warehouse on the night of the theft. "You knew your dad well. Better than anyone. Do you recognize any of these names? Someone who might have had a grudge against him or reason to frame him?" James scanned the list, his brow furrowed in concentration. One name jumped out at him: Elliot Grayson, a shift supervisor who had clashed with Robert over workplace safety violations. "Elliot Grayson," James said, pointing at the name. "Dad told me about him once. He said Grayson didn't like him because Dad reported some safety issues to management." Michael nodded, jotting down the information. "That's good to know. It gives us a possible motive. I'll look into him." James hesitated, then added, "Chief Carter, thank you for believing me." Michael smiled faintly. "Don't thank me yet, James. We're not there yet, but I promise you, I won't stop until we uncover the truth." The following morning, Ryan Walker called Michael with his findings. "Chief, you were right. The surveillance footage was tampered with. Someone overlaid a false timestamp and deliberately blurred the frames showing the suspect's face." Michael felt a surge of vindication. "Can you trace the edits back to their source?" "I'm working on it," Ryan replied, "but whoever did this knew what they were doing. It's going to take time." Michael's phone buzzed with another call, this time from the warehouse security team. They had located the original access logs and sent them over. As Michael reviewed the data, one entry stood out. Robert Miller's access card hadn't been used at all on the night of the theft. Instead, another card, registered to Elliot Grayson, had been used at the exact time the theft occurred. Armed with this new information, Michael decided it was time to confront Hayes. Michael found Marcus Hayes in the precinct's locker room, his demeanor as confident and smug as ever. Hayes was the kind of officer who thrived on manipulation, always staying just within the bounds of plausible deniability. "Marcus," Michael began, his tone calm but firm. "We need to talk." Hayes looked up from tying his boots, raising an eyebrow. "What's this about, Chief?" "It's about Robert Miller," Michael said, holding up the access logs. "I have evidence that his card wasn't used on the night of the theft. Someone else was. And the surveillance footage? It was doctored." Hayes's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "Sounds like a lot of speculation to me. What are you getting at?" Michael stepped closer, his voice low and deadly. "I know you framed him, Marcus, and I know you coerced Paul Stevenson into lying. It's only a matter of time before the rest of the pieces fall into place." Hayes stood, his expression darkening. "Be careful, Michael. You don't want to make accusations you can't back up. And even if you're right, who do you think they'll believe? The chief who's been here for a year? Or the lieutenant who's been cleaning up this department for decades?" Michael held his ground, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't just about you, Hayes. It's about the system you've corrupted. And I'll burn it all down if I have to." Hayes chuckled darkly. "Good luck, Chief. You'll need it." Michael's next step was to bring Paul Stevenson under police protection. With Paul's confession and the new evidence, Michael began building a case against Hayes. He also reached out to the district attorney's office, requesting a special hearing to reopen Robert Miller's case. Word spread quickly through the department, and tensions mounted. Some officers sided with Michael, while others remained loyal to Hayes. The precinct became a battleground of whispers and divided loyalties. James, meanwhile, continued to assist Michael by gathering small but critical pieces of information. His determination inspired those around him, including Ryan, who worked tirelessly to trace the tampered footage to Hayes's computer. Finally, after weeks of preparation, Michael had enough evidence to move forward. The special hearing was scheduled, and Michael prepared to present his findings. The hearing was tense. the atmosphere charged with anticipation. Michael presented the access logs, the tampered footage, and Paul's testimony, painting a damning picture of Hayes's actions. Hayes's defense was weak, relying on deflection and denial. James sat in the back row with his mother, clutching her hand tightly as the proceedings unfolded. For the first time, he saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, declaring Robert Miller innocent and ordering his immediate release, the courtroom erupted in murmurs. Tears streamed down Linda's face as James hugged her tightly. As Robert walked into the courtroom, a free man at last, James ran to embrace him. "I knew you didn't do it, Dad," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I knew you wouldn't give up on me," Robert replied, his voice filled with pride. The Miller family returned home that evening, their small apartment filled with a sense of relief and joy that had been absent for over a year. Robert sat on the worn couch, his hands resting on his knees, as if still processing the fact that he was free. Linda set a steaming cup of tea in front of him, her eyes red from tears but glowing with happiness. James sat beside his father, clutching the old watch. "Dad, I never gave up. I knew you didn't belong in there." Robert placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. "You've grown up so much, James. You've been stronger than I ever could have imagined. I'm proud of you, son." Linda joined them, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "We've been through so much, but now we can move forward together." For the first time in years, the Millers felt like they could dream again. Robert spoke about finding work to support the family. Linda planned to cut back her hours at the laundromat, and James shared his growing ambition to one day fight for justice as a lawyer. That night, as they sat around the dinner table, laughter filled the room. It was a modest meal, but it felt like a feast after the long ordeal they had endured. The days that followed were filled with small but meaningful victories. Michael Carter arranged for Robert to work as a maintenance technician at the police department, a position that would allow him to slowly rebuild his life. It wasn't glamorous, but to Robert, it was a symbol of starting over. Linda, encouraged by Rebecca Carter's support, found a new job as a receptionist at a local community center. The work was less grueling than the laundromat, and it gave her a chance to reconnect with people in the neighborhood. James, however, was already looking ahead. His bravery during the ordeal had earned him recognition at school and even a small scholarship from a local organization. But what truly fueled his resolve was his growing understanding of how many others in his community faced injustice. One evening, James approached Michael at the police station. "Chief Carter, I've been thinking a lot about what happened with my dad. If it weren't for you and the investigation, he'd still be in prison. I want to help others the way you helped us." Michael smiled, leaning back in his chair. "James, you've got the heart for it. No doubt about that. But fighting for justice takes more than courage, it takes knowledge and patience. Have you thought about what you want to do?" James nodded, his eyes shining with determination. "I want to be a lawyer." Michael leaned forward, his expression serious but encouraging. "That's a tough road, James, but I believe you can do it. If you ever need guidance, you know where to find me." James began volunteering at a local legal aid organization, run by an experienced lawyer named Laura Winslow. Laura had read about James's story in the papers and was eager to mentor him. She started him on simple tasks, organizing files, summarizing case notes, but James quickly proved to be a fast learner. "James," Laura said one afternoon, watching him pore over a stack of legal documents, "you've got a knack for this. Have you thought about formal training?" "I have," James replied. "I want to go to law school. I want to help people who don't have a voice." Laura smiled, impressed by his determination. "Well, if you keep this up, I might just have to write you a recommendation." As James balanced school, volunteering, and helping his family, he became a beacon of hope in his community. His story inspired others to stand up against injustice, and he began mentoring younger kids, teaching them about courage and resilience. One day, while working at the legal aid office, James came across a case that hit close to home. A single mother, Maria Lopez, had been evicted from her apartment due to forged documents by a corrupt landlord. Maria's story reminded James of the helplessness his family had felt during Robert's trial. "Ms. Winslow," James said, holding up the case file, "we have to help her. This isn't just about an eviction, it's about stopping people from taking advantage of others." Laura agreed, and they began building Maria's case. James worked tirelessly, interviewing witnesses, gathering evidence, and even coordinating with local activists to raise awareness about housing rights. The case went to court, and while Laura led the arguments, James sat beside her, watching and learning. When the judge ruled in Maria's favor, granting her compensation and penalizing the landlord, James felt a surge of pride. It was his first taste of victory in the fight for justice. Years passed, and James's hard work paid off. With the support of his family, Michael, and Laura, he was accepted into law school. The day he received his acceptance letter, Robert handed him the watch, its once frozen hands now ticking steadily. "You've earned this, son," Robert said. "This watch kept me going when I had nothing else. Now it's your turn to keep it moving forward." James held the watch tightly, feeling the weight of his father's words. "I'll make you proud, Dad." After graduating with honors, James returned to his neighborhood, opening a small legal office to provide free and low-cost services to those in need. He named it the Miller Justice Center, a tribute to his family's journey. People from all walks of life came to his office, seeking help for issues ranging from wrongful convictions to housing disputes. James took on each case with the same passion and dedication that had driven him as a boy fighting for his father's freedom. One day, a young boy walked into the office, his eyes wide with admiration. "Mr. Miller, I want to be like you. Can you teach me how to help people?" James smiled, seeing a reflection of his younger self in the boy. "Of course, but the first thing you need to know is that justice takes courage. Are you ready for that?" The boy nodded eagerly, and James handed him a small notebook. "Start by writing down everything you believe in. That's the foundation of your fight." As James's reputation grew, so did his impact. He began mentoring young lawyers, organizing community workshops, and advocating for systemic change. His work inspired countless others to pursue justice, not just in Eastbridge but across the country. Years later, as James stood in his office, now bustling with activity, he looked at the watch on his wrist. It was more than a timepiece, it was a reminder of the battles fought, the lives changed, and the journey that had brought him here. Justice, he realized, wasn't just something you achieved. It was something you built, piece by piece, day by day, and James Miller was determined to keep building, no matter how long it took.